Arab prince caught the maid's daughter reading his private letters. What she discovered next shocked them both. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Almazar's grand palace, transforming the familiar corridors into something almost dreamlike. It was a Monday in late autumn, a day that would ordinarily slip into obscurity, unremarkable and forgotten like countless others before it. Yet somewhere within these ancient walls, secrets lay dormant, secrets that would soon reshape the destiny of an entire kingdom and irrevocably change the lives of those who uncovered them. Prince Zayed bin Hassan stood alone in his private study, surrounded by mahogany furnishings and walls lined with leather-bound volumes that had belonged to his ancestors for generations. At 28, he carried the weight of succession with the careful precision of someone who understood that every decision, every glance, every word would eventually be scrutinized by historians and political analysts. His dark eyes moved across a spreadsheet, and with each line he read, his frown deepened. The discrepancies had begun appearing 6 months earlier, nothing dramatic, nothing that would immediately trigger alarms in the minds of ordinary observers. But Prince Zayed was not an ordinary observer. He possessed an eye for detail that had been cultivated through years of rigorous training in statecraft and financial management. A few million dinars here, a misaligned signature there, a charitable project that seemed to exist only on paper. Individually, these anomalies could be dismissed as clerical errors or bureaucratic oversight. Collectively, they formed a pattern that gnawed at him like an unhealed wound. He had attempted to address the matter through official channels, requesting audits from the kingdom's treasury ministry. But the responses had been frustratingly vague. Reports filled with technical jargon that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate recommendations to improve record-keeping procedures, assurances that everything was under control. None of it satisfied him. In fact, it only deepened his suspicion that something was fundamentally wrong. That evening, he had made the decision to investigate personally. He would organize his private correspondence in the Grand Library, a task that would give him legitimate reason to review documents that had accumulated over years. Correspondence from various government departments, charity organizations, international partners, and financial institutions. The library was his sanctuary, a place where few dared venture without explicit permission. Its soaring ceilings, its towering shelves, its cathedral-like silence, all of it conspired to make it the one place in the palace where he could think with absolute clarity. The Grand Library was located in the palace's east wing, a section built during the reign of Zayed's great-grandfather. It contained over 50,000 volumes, including rare manuscripts, historical documents, and the personal papers of every member of the royal family for the past century. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged paper, leather, and something else, the indefinable smell of accumulated time and history. Zayed had spent the first hour arranging files, his mind working through the various possibilities. Perhaps the discrepancies were the result of incompetence rather than malice. Perhaps one of the financial officers had been making errors, and an honest auditor would quickly resolve everything. Or perhaps, and this thought made his stomach tighten, someone had been deliberately stealing from the kingdom, using the cover of charitable work and state bureaucracy to mask their crimes. It was at this point, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that he heard the sound, a faint rustling, barely audible above the profound silence of the library, the whisper of pages being turned. Someone was in his sanctuary. His immediate reaction was indignation, a sharp, almost physical surge of anger at this violation of his private space. But as a prince, he had learned to master his emotions, to channel them into purposeful action rather than allowing them to control him. He moved quietly between the towering bookcases, his footsteps making no sound against the marble floor. When he finally saw her, he stopped as though he had walked into an invisible wall. Amina sat cross-legged on the marble floor in the narrow space between two of the oldest bookcases, the ones containing documents from the 19th century. She was barely 16, with delicate features that bore the unmistakable resemblance to her mother, Fatima bin Muhammad, one of the most conscientious members of the palace's housekeeping staff. Amina's dark eyes were wide with concentration, her entire being focused on the folder in her lap, which bore the royal crest stamped in gold leaf across its cover. Her fingers moved with reverent care as she turned each page, as though she were handling something simultaneously dangerous and sacred. She wore the simple servant's clothes issued to family members of palace staff, her long dark hair tied back in a plain braid. On her face was an expression of such intense focus that for a moment Zayed found himself mesmerized rather than outraged. She was reading his private letters, state correspondence, documents that contained information pertaining to security, diplomacy, and the kingdom's most sensitive financial matters. "What are you doing?" His voice cut through the library's silence like a blade through silk. Amina's entire body went rigid. The folder slipped from her trembling fingers, scattering papers across the marble floor like autumn leaves caught in an unexpected gust of wind. She spun around, her eyes going wide with terror as she recognized who had spoken. I'm sorry, Your Highness. I didn't mean to." Her voice came out in fragmented stammers, broken by obvious fear and the kind of shame that comes from being discovered doing something forbidden. Within seconds, the palace guards appeared, seemingly from nowhere. They moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the girl, their hands moving toward their weapons with the unconscious readiness of men trained for conflict. But Prince Zayed raised a single hand, and they froze, becoming as still and silent as the marble columns that supported the library's soaring ceiling. His dark eyes remained fixed on Amina, studying her with an intensity that made her tremble even more violently. She seemed to shrink under that gaze, trying to make herself smaller, as though she could somehow disappear if she contracted herself enough. "Those letters are confidential," he said, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Do you comprehend the penalties for unauthorized access to state documents?" The color drained completely from Amina's face. In the kingdom of Al-Mazar, as in many traditional monarchies, the penalties for breaching royal security could be severe. At minimum, she would be imprisoned. More likely, her entire family would be implicated, her mother would lose her position, and they would be cast out into a life of destitution. Tears began to cascade down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I wasn't snooping, Your Highness," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear on my mother's life, I wasn't trying to spy or steal anything. I was cleaning the library this morning, dusting the shelves as I do every week. one of the envelopes fell from this shelf." She gestured toward the space behind her, "and I picked it up to return it. That's all I meant to do, Your Highness. But when I saw what was written on the envelope, I thought maybe I should at least verify where it belonged before I gave it to the guards." She paused, seeming to gather courage from somewhere deep within herself. When she continued, her voice had steadied slightly, though the tears continued to flow. "I opened it very carefully, and I read the first paragraph. And then I saw something that didn't make sense to me. I know I shouldn't have kept reading, but I needed to understand. I needed to know if what I was seeing was real or if I was misunderstanding something. Despite the gravity of the situation, despite all his training and protocol awareness, Prince Zayed found himself intrigued. "Explain yourself," he commanded, his tone shifting from pure condemnation to something more nuanced, curiosity mixed with caution. He settled himself on the edge of one of the reading tables, his eyes never leaving the girl's face. "What didn't make sense to you?" Amina hesitated for a long moment, clearly struggling with the weight of her situation. Then she reached down and gathered several of the scattered papers, her hands moving with careful deliberation. She held up one envelope, and Zayed could see his own handwriting on the front. "This document here," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about the content rather than her own predicament. "It's a letter confirming that 10 million dinars were allocated for the reconstruction of the northern orphanage in Kasira province. The letter is dated 4 months ago, and it's addressed to the director of the charity ministry. It's signed by you and countersigned by the deputy minister of finance." She pulled another document from the scattered pile, her eyes now shining with something beyond fear, something that resembled intellectual excitement. "But according to this inspection report, which was officially filed with the Royal Council just last week, the orphanage in Kasira was actually closed and demolished 2 years ago. The building is completely gone. The report is very detailed. It includes photographs, architectural assessments, and interviews with local officials. They all confirm that there is no orphanage to rebuild. There hasn't been one for 2 years. The library fell into a silence so profound that it seemed to compress the air itself. Prince Zayed's jaw tightened imperceptibly as he took the papers from Amina's trembling hands. His eyes scanned the documents with the trained precision of someone who had reviewed thousands of official communications. The girl was absolutely correct. The numbers matched. The signatures appeared authentic. The letterhead was official. And yet, according to the inspection report she had referenced, the entire premise of the authorization was fraudulent. Someone had authorized a 10 million dinar payment for a project that could not possibly exist. A cold certainty settled into Zayed's chest. This was not an error. This was not clerical incompetence or bureaucratic confusion. This was deliberate fraud. And the scale of it, if this was merely one example among many, could be staggering. "How many of these did you find?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that preceded storms. "5 so far, Your Highness," Amina replied. "But I was only halfway through the folder when you came in. I suspect there are more." Zayed stood abruptly, his mind racing through the implications, calculating the political consequences, considering who might be involved and how deep the conspiracy might run. "Where exactly did you find these?" he demanded. "This section of the library, Your Highness," Amina said, pointing to the narrow space between the two towering bookcases. "Behind this bookcase. I think the envelope must have been placed there hastily, maybe accidentally pushed back when someone was in a hurry. Or possibly—" She trailed off, uncertainty crossing her face. "Possibly what?" Zayed pressed. "Possibly someone intentionally hid them here, thinking they would never be found. This section is rarely accessed, isn't it? I only dust here because my mother trained me to be thorough, to not neglect any area no matter how remote." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had been discovered seemed to settle over the library like a heavy blanket, stifling and suffocating. "What is your name?" Zayed asked suddenly, as though seeing the girl for the first time. "Amina bint Fatima bin Mohammed, Your Highness. My mother is Fatima, who works in the palace housekeeping department. She has been employed here for 23 years. How old are you, Amina?" 16 years old, Your Highness. "And have you attended formal schooling?" "Only until I was 12, Your Highness. My family could not afford to continue my education after my father passed away 3 years ago. But my mother—" Amina's voice became softer, more filled with the warmth of genuine affection. "My mother has been teaching me every night. She taught herself to read and write through sheer determination, using books from this very library when she was permitted to clean it. She's always said that knowledge is the only thing in this world that no one can steal from you, that no one can take away no matter what circumstances befall you. She said education is a weapon against injustice and poverty, and she's been passing that knowledge to me as though her life depends on it." Something in that statement seemed to resonate deeply within Prince Zayed. Here was a girl, a servant's daughter, who had been denied the formal educational privileges that most children of her station never even anticipated receiving. Yet she possessed the analytical mind, the attention to detail, and the intellectual courage to catch what trained auditors, experienced counselors, and senior government officials had somehow overlooked. The cosmic unfairness of it struck him like a physical blow. This girl had more insight and integrity than most of the educated elite he worked with daily. "I'm going to ask you to do something," he said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate precision. "And I need your absolute discretion. What you've discovered here cannot be discussed with anyone, not your mother, not your closest friends, not anyone in the palace. Can you do that?" Amina's eyes widened. For a moment, Zayed saw her weighing the enormity of what he was asking against her obvious desire to confide in her mother, who had been her sole source of guidance and protection after her father's death. "Yes, Your Highness," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can do that." Over the next 3 hours, Prince Zayed and Amina worked through the files together in the library's growing darkness, illuminated only by the soft glow of the ancient brass lamps that lined the reading tables. Line by line, page by page, she pointed out discrepancies that made her eyes light up with the peculiar thrill of intellectual discovery, mismatched signatures where the document was supposedly signed by one official but bore handwriting characteristics of another, funds allocated for projects that never appeared in any official record, payments made to contractors who had no legitimate business registrations with the kingdom's commerce ministry. Her mind worked like an intricate piece of machinery, methodical and precise, catching details that seemed to slip past the trained eyes of experienced professionals. When Zayed pointed out a discrepancy she had missed, she studied it intently, then shook her head. "No, Your Highness," she said respectfully. "Look at this signature here. It's authentic. I've verified it against 10 other documents from the same person. But this one," she indicated another document, "is forged. The person who created this forgery was skilled, but they made a mistake. They were too consistent. Real handwriting varies slightly from document to document, but this person replicated the exact same pressure, the exact same angle, in 3 consecutive signatures. It's mathematically impossible for the same person to write identically 3 times in a row." By the time midnight approached and the palace's ancient clock tower began its solemn chiming, the prince had reached a profound conclusion. This girl was no ordinary maid's daughter. She possessed something rare and precious, a combination of intelligence, integrity, and intuition that seemed to transcend social class and formal education entirely. "Tomorrow," he said as they prepared to leave the library, "you will come back here. Tell your mother you've been assigned to help catalog the library's collection. This is a legitimate assignment. I'm authorizing it now. No one will question it. In the meantime, we need to trace this corruption to its source. We need to understand how deep it goes and who is involved." Amina's eyes widened. "You're trusting me, Your Highness, after you caught me reading your private documents?" "I am," he replied simply, "because you've proven yourself to be trustworthy in a moment when you could have remained silent. You could have put those documents back and pretended you never saw them. But you came forward with what you discovered, even knowing the risks to yourself. That takes a particular kind of courage and integrity. Yes, I'm trusting you." Over the following weeks, a clandestine partnership began to form within the palace walls, hidden in plain sight. To the outside world, Amina was simply a girl hired as a junior librarian, a minor domestic appointment that warranted no special attention and certainly no suspicion. In reality, she became Prince Zayed's closest confidant, meeting with him every evening in the library after the other palace staff had left for the night, working together to unravel one of the most elaborate corruption schemes in the kingdom's modern history. Working late into the nights, surrounded by the leather-bound silence of the ancient library, they discovered a web of embezzlement that reached far deeper and extended into far more spheres of government than anyone had anticipated. Ministers of state, treasurers, officials at the highest levels of government, even some members of the Royal Advisory Council, all were implicated in a carefully orchestrated theft of public funds meant for the kingdom's most vulnerable citizens. The scope was staggering. Not just millions of dinars, but billions. Orphanages that didn't exist, schools that were never built, hospitals that existed only on paper, disaster relief funds that were siphoned off before they ever reached affected communities, medical supplies that were diverted to black markets, educational programs that were canceled mid-year with the allocated funds disappearing into private accounts. But as they dug deeper, following the paper trail through increasingly complex layers of financial obfuscation, they discovered something that made both of them go pale with shock. Forged documents bearing Prince Zayed's own signature. Someone within the inner circle had been committing crimes under his name, using his authority as a shield against investigation. If this were to be discovered publicly without careful handling, it could undermine not just the prince's credibility, but the fundamental stability of the kingdom itself. It could trigger a constitutional crisis. It could give ammunition to radical elements who had long questioned the legitimacy of the monarchy. "We need to be careful," Amina said one night, her young face looking older than her years as she studied the documents by lamplight. "If we expose this carelessly, if we don't present this correctly, it will create chaos. People will lose faith in the entire royal family. There could be instability, possibly even violence. We need to think this through carefully." The prince looked at her with something approaching wonder, mixed with deep concern. "You're thinking like a statesman, not a teenager," he observed. "Most people in this palace have been trained in diplomacy and statecraft from birth, and yet they don't possess the wisdom you're demonstrating." "My mother always says that wisdom has nothing to do with age," Amina replied thoughtfully. "Wisdom comes from understanding the consequences of our actions, from thinking beyond ourselves to consider how our choices affect others. Age is just a number. Character is what matters." Together, they crafted a strategy. Rather than immediately exposing the scandal publicly, they quietly gathered every piece of evidence, building an irrefutable case with careful documentation. They consulted with individuals they could trust, honest auditors, loyal military officers, faithful advisers whose integrity was beyond question and whose loyalty to the kingdom superseded any political calculation. Piece by piece, a new narrative was constructed. A strategy was developed for how this would be presented to the public, how the guilty would be brought to justice without shaking the foundations of the state. The plan required delicate orchestration, timing, and the cooperation of multiple government institutions. And then came the twist that neither of them had anticipated. 3 weeks into their investigation, on a Friday evening when Amina was supposed to arrive at the library for their usual meeting, she never came. The prince waited in the library, growing increasingly concerned as the hours passed. The grandfather clock chimed 7 o'clock, then 8. By 9, his anxiety had transformed into genuine alarm. Something was wrong. Amina had never missed a meeting, never sent word that she would be delayed. Their partnership had developed an almost sacred quality, a commitment that transcended the normal protocols of palace life. When a palace guard finally found him near midnight, moving restlessly between the bookcases, the news made his blood run cold in a way that few things ever did. Fatima, Amina's mother, had been taken critically ill. She had collapsed while working in the guest quarters, and the palace physicians feared it was something grave. She was now in the royal medical wing, unconscious and deteriorating rapidly. Her condition was deteriorating faster than any natural illness would account for. Prince Zayed found Amina in the hospital corridor outside her mother's room, sitting on a bench with her knees drawn up to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She looked as though she had been crying for hours, her eyes swollen and red, her entire body trembling with a combination of fear and grief. She looked up when he approached, and the anguish in her eyes was almost unbearable to witness. "Your Highness," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I didn't know where else to go. I didn't know what to do. The doctors won't tell me anything. They just keep saying she's stable, but critical. What does that mean? What's happening to her?" "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, sitting beside her and taking her trembling hand gently. "She was fine this morning," Amina said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We had breakfast together. I made her favorite bread with honey. She was so happy, Your Highness. She was proud because I had told her last night that I'd been offered a permanent position working with you on important palace business. She said it was the best news she'd heard in years, that all her sacrifices had been worth it. She said she knew I would do something great, that I would help change the world. And then she trailed off, unable to continue, the sobs overwhelming her. And then? Zayed prompted gently. And then, this afternoon, around 3 o'clock, I saw my mother's friend Noura, another housekeeping staff member, and she said my mother had collapsed in the guest quarters. She was conscious but confused, saying she couldn't see properly and that everything hurt. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was losing consciousness. The doctors think it was poison, Your Highness. Someone poisoned my mother. The implication crashed over Zayed like a tidal wave. Someone had discovered their investigation. Someone knew that Amina was working with him. Someone had decided to send a message, and that message was written in a mother's blood. I'm going to have the best physicians in the kingdom brought to your mother's side, he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of royal authority and personal commitment. She will receive every care available to us. You have my word on this. Over the next 48 hours, as Amina kept vigil at her mother's bedside, refusing to leave even to sleep or eat, Prince Zayed launched a careful investigation into who had access to Fatima's food and water during the day. The results of that investigation were both revealing and deeply disturbing. One of the kitchen staff members, a man named Hassan, who had worked in the palace for 15 years and come from a relatively poor family in the city's outskirts, was found to have extensive financial connections to one of the corrupt ministers, the very one who stood to lose the most when the embezzlement scheme was exposed. Hassan's bank record showed recent deposits that far exceeded his normal salary. Phone records indicated regular contact with the minister in question. Most damning of all, traces of a rare poison were found in his personal quarters. A poison known to be virtually undetectable in food and water until it had already entered the bloodstream. The interrogation that followed was brief and brutal. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the weight of the prince's authority, Hassan broke quickly, his defenses crumbling like sand castles in a storm. He revealed that he had been instructed to poison Fatima as a warning, a message designed to intimidate Amina into silence. The message was clear. Stop helping the prince investigate, or worse would follow. But in his desperation to save himself from the most severe penalties, Hassan made a crucial mistake. He revealed something that no one had anticipated, something that changed the entire equation of the investigation. Fatima herself had known about the corruption years ago, when she had been younger and newly hired. She had been assigned to work in the royal treasury offices. During her time there, before she had been reassigned to housekeeping, she had witnessed suspicious transactions. She had observed officials making unauthorized withdrawals, destroying records, and communicating with people who had no legitimate reason to be in the palace. Worried and confused, she had approached one of the senior ministers about her concerns. But instead of taking her seriously, he had dismissed her, warned her that idle gossip could get her fired, and suggested that she focus on her work rather than concerning herself with matters beyond her understanding. More than that, Hassan revealed under interrogation, Fatima had actually kept her own hidden records, documentation that she had secretly maintained all these years, a parallel accounting system that she had created and hidden, waiting for the day when the truth might matter. When this information reached Amina, sitting in the hospital waiting room with eyes that had forgotten how to close, she immediately revealed where her mother had hidden these documents. A small locked box beneath the floorboards of their modest home in the servants' quarters, a space that she and her mother had discovered years ago. The contents of that box changed everything, absolutely everything. Fatima's meticulous notes, written in a simple but unmistakably clear hand, provided the missing pieces to a puzzle that was far larger and more complex than anyone had realized. They showed that the corruption had been ongoing for more than a decade, that it had involved at least 7 high-ranking officials in active conspiracy, with connections to countless others in passive complicity. But most significantly, Fatima's record showed something that sent shock waves through the entire investigation. Roots of the corruption extended back to before Prince Zayed had even begun his official duties. The conspiracy was not something that had begun under his watch. It had been in motion for years, operating with impunity under the previous administration. This last revelation was what truly stunned everyone involved. The implication was staggering. Members of the royal family itself, members of the old guard who had served under Zayed's father, might be implicated in the scheme. The corruption was not just a matter of government theft. It was potentially a matter of internal family betrayal. King Hassan, Zayed's father, was now in his 70s and had been gradually transitioning his duties to his son over the past 2 years. The old king had always been a just ruler, but he had also been someone who preferred to delegate authority and trust his advisors. It was entirely possible that corrupt ministers had been taking advantage of that delegation for years. The question now became, did King Hassan know about the corruption? Was he complicit, or had he been victimized by the very people he trusted? The investigation expanded rapidly. Zayed brought in auditors from outside the kingdom, forensic accountants from international firms, and investigators whose loyalty could not be questioned. What they uncovered was a labyrinth of financial crime that stretched across 3 decades of palace administration. The stolen funds amounted to over 2 billion dinars. 2 billion dinars that should have gone to orphans, to the poor, to disaster victims, to education, to health care. 2 billion dinars that had instead enriched corrupt officials, funded their private businesses, paid for their children's educations abroad, purchased properties, and luxury goods. The orphans and the vulnerable had been victimized twice over, first by circumstance and poverty, then by those entrusted to help them. But as the investigation deepened further, Zayed began to uncover something even more disturbing. The corruption was not simply about theft. It was about power and control. Some of the funds had been diverted to fund private militias, to finance operations that had nothing to do with government business. There were weapons purchases, bribes to foreign entities, funding for political movements that had nothing to do with the kingdom's interests. The conspiracy, it became clear, was not just about enriching individuals. It was about maintaining power through a network of corruption so deep and so comprehensive that it had essentially created a shadow government operating within the legitimate government itself. And at the heart of this shadow government was someone that Zayed trusted, someone he had known his entire life, someone who had been an advisor to his father and now served as an advisor to him, his uncle, Prince Rashid. The revelation struck like a lightning bolt. Prince Rashid, the king's younger brother, had been the architect of the entire conspiracy. He had used his position of trust to coordinate the various corrupt ministers, to ensure that investigations were blocked, and to maintain the system of theft and embezzlement. And he had done this all while presenting himself as a loyal family member and devoted servant of the state. When Zayed confronted his uncle with the evidence in a private meeting in the palace's formal reception room, the old prince did not deny it. Instead, he smiled, a smile of such profound bitterness that it seemed to reveal the true nature of the man beneath the facade. "Do you think you're the first prince to inherit a kingdom and immediately believe you must reform everything?" Rashid asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you think you're special because you care about the poor and want to end corruption?" "I built this system because it works, Zayed. For 30 years, while your father was content to simply reign, I ensured that this kingdom remained strong through the power of those who truly understand how the world operates." "You stole from the people," Zayed said, his voice cold with fury. "You stole from the kingdom that our family has ruled for generations." "I invested in the kingdom's true interests," Rashid countered, "not the fantasy interests you imagine, where every dinar goes to some orphan or some sick child. Real power requires real resources in the hands of real people who understand how to use them. Your father was too soft, and now you, with your idealistic notions and your trust in the common people, you will destroy everything we've built." "You're under arrest," Zayed said simply. "Guards will escort you from the palace immediately. You will stand trial for your crimes against the kingdom." But as the guards moved to apprehend his uncle, Rashid stood, and for a moment his face transformed. The anger and bitterness faded, replaced by something almost like sadness. "You don't understand?" he said quietly. "I did this for you. I did this to protect you, to prepare you. The kingdom is not the gentle place you imagine it to be. It requires men willing to make hard choices, willing to bend rules for the greater good. I've been protecting you from that reality your entire life, and now you're old enough to understand it. You reject it." "No," Zayed said, his voice unwavering. "I reject you. I reject your corruption. I reject the idea that betraying the kingdom's people somehow serves them. That is not protection. That is tyranny, wrapped in a pretty excuse." In the days and weeks that followed, as the investigation reached its conclusion and the evidence was compiled for legal proceedings, Prince Zayed faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could have covered it up. He could have limited the investigation to lower-level officials and protected his uncle from public humiliation. He could have maintained the facade of a stable, united royal family. But doing so would have meant perpetuating the corruption. It would have meant allowing a system of theft and betrayal to continue operating beneath the surface of legitimate government. It would have meant betraying everything that Amina and her mother represented. The idea that integrity matters more than convenience, that truth matters more than comfort. Against the vehement advice of his anxious advisers and worried family members, including his own father, who wept at the thought of his brother's betrayal, Prince Zayed made the decision to proceed with full exposure of the corruption. He requested a televised address to the nation, broadcast simultaneously on every news channel, internet platform, and radio station in the kingdom. The revelation shocked the nation. Prince Zayed stood before the cameras in the palace's formal broadcast studio, his face showing every bit of the strain and exhaustion of the past weeks. Behind him, displayed on massive screens visible throughout the kingdom, were the documents, the evidence, the proof of corruption reaching into the highest levels of government. He spoke for nearly 3 hours, detailing the conspiracy, naming names, explaining how billions of dinars had been stolen from the kingdom's people. He did not spare himself. He acknowledged that he had been negligent in not discovering the corruption sooner, that he should have been more vigilant, that his trust in those around him had been misplaced. But more importantly, he did something unprecedented. He publicly acknowledged the role of a servant's daughter in uncovering the conspiracy. He told the story of Amina, of her intelligence and courage, of how she had risked everything to bring the truth to light. If it were not for a 16-year-old girl who believed that knowledge is a tool for justice, he said, his voice carrying across the kingdom, the corruption would have continued. Our people would have continued to suffer. The guilty would have continued to enrich themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. He also publicly acknowledged his uncle's betrayal. As difficult as it was for him to speak about it, as painful as the truth was, he could not hide it. Prince Rashid was arrested and charged with treason, fraud, and crimes against the state. The scandal that erupted was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Ministers resigned or were arrested. Foreign contractors were extradited to face charges. Government bureaucrats at every level were investigated, some found guilty and removed from their positions. The royal treasury launched internal investigations that would eventually take years to complete. But there was something else that happened in the aftermath of the revelation, a profound shift in how the nation viewed Prince Zayed. His willingness to expose corruption even when it touched the edges of his own family, his commitment to justice over convenience, and his humble acknowledgement of his own failings resonated deeply with the people. The kingdom, watching their young prince stand before them with honesty and vulnerability, began to believe that real change might be possible. And then, in a move that shocked the conservative establishment and sent political analysts into frenzied discussions about the future of the monarchy, Zayed did something unprecedented. He granted Amina formal public recognition for her role in uncovering the corruption. In a ceremony attended by hundreds of government officials, military leaders, international diplomats, and ordinary citizens, held in the palace's Grand Hall, Prince Zayed presented Amina with the Royal Medal of Merit, the kingdom's highest civilian honor. He also announced her official appointment as the kingdom's first-ever Chief of Internal Oversight, a position created specifically to prevent such corruption from ever taking root again.